thing that Poppy oversaw in September of 1976. He was only confirmed that February, but in September of that year, there was a bombing on DC's Embassy Row. There was a terrorist assassination of the former Chilean ambassador to President Allende, a man named Orlando Letelier. Him and an American associate, a woman named Ronnie Moffett, were assassinated with a car bomb in the middle of Washington, D.C.
DuPont motherfucking circle.
On Embassy Row, the highest security place in D.C. outside of the White House. This is where every country in the world has their embassy. We've driven past it. Some of them are very impressive, some of them not so much.
Can you believe we went from this to Lev Parnas?
Yeah, if you're not strapping a bomb to a fucking chassis of a car, what are you even doing? I don't care.
Subsequent investigations by Chileans revealed that the assassination had been carried out by a former CIA contractor by the name of Michael Towney at the direction of Chile under Pinochet's DINA security director. It was their terrifying internal security forces, and they carried out this assassination on American soil, including killing an American citizen as part of what was known as Operation Condor, which was this international program of assassinations that was kind of like Operation Phoenix, but for the Western Hemisphere. And the idea was, it was like this fascist spider web that would like any sympathizer of any socialist government, they would touch you in any country that you were in. It didn't matter if they didn't have to disappear you just because you were in Argentina or Chile or whatever.
Yeah.
They would kill you in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Why did they do that? Well, it's because when you kill someone with a car bomb in D.C., the CIA tends to take notice of something like that. Except George H.W. Bush was director of the CIA at the time, and I was reading it here. It says, under CIA Director George H.W. Bush, leaked for public consumption through Newsweek magazine. He leaked an intelligence assessment to Newsweek magazine, clearing the Chilean government's feared intelligence service, DINA, which was then run by Contreras, who was another very scary guy. Relying on the word of Bush's CIA, Newsweek reported that the Chilean secret police were not involved in the Letelier assassination. The Central Intelligence Agency reached its decision because the bomb was too crude to be the work of experts, and because the murder was coming while Chile's rulers were wooing U.S. support. It could only damage the Santiago regime.
Operation Condor, just a side note, had the benefit for sickos on the American side in that it was like the greatest direct mail child theft ring probably of all time.
Was it like John Negroponte when he was ambassador to Honduras was running a child adoption racket?
Yeah.
Of orphans who were made by the dirty war that he was running, he was selling to American families through the U.S. Embassy in Honduras?
Yeah. There's been a lot of media made about the theft of babies, specifically in Argentina, but they were doing it everywhere that Condor was.
One last thing about CIA contractor Michael Towney, who planted the car bomb. And this is another thing that rhymes with the career of George H.W. Bush and his entire family. Would it surprise you to learn that Michael Towney was on the State Department's watch list for international terrorism, but was allowed to enter the country more or less completely unmolested? Does that sound familiar to anyone?
And so when the CIA said that, the Chileans, they didn't do this, we know, trust us. Who did it? Their argument was it was communists who were trying to make Letelier a martyr. It's like they were imagining an international communist movement where they're like, hey, Orlando, would you be willing to die for clout? And he was like, absolutely.
But unfortunately, Orlando Letelier wasn't the only assassination causing a headache for Poppy. There was still the matter of Dallas in 1963 for him to nail shut. I'm gonna read a quote now from Russ Baker's book. Although Poppy couldn't remember where he had been on November 22nd, 1963.
Who could?
and couldn't be bothered to recall his old friend George de Mohrenschildt's precise role.
Who's that?
In the matter or in the life of Lee Harvey Oswald. As CIA director, he began paying keen attention to the resurgent assassination investigations. So, Poppy composed an internal memo asking after a report regarding a visit by Jack Ruby to Santo Traficante. It says Traficante, 2 years after Bush left the CIA as director, would admit to congressional investigators of being part of a CIA operation to assassinate Castro in the 1960s. In 1960. As a side note, I didn't know this until I was researching it for the show today. Sam Giancana was killed in 1975 by an unknown gunman shortly before he was set to testify to the Church Committee about his role in the many plots against Castro.
He was cooking sausage and peppers. Somebody came up and bing, right in the head.
Just a little bit like a little bit of like the mafia flavor to the Kennedy assassination here. Just another quote. It says here, later the committee decided, this is speaking of, Traficante said he was brought into the Castro thing by Johnny Roselli. And he testifies, later the committee decided to recall Roselli for additional testimony when he was called up. But by the time he was called, he had already been missing for several days. His decomposing body was later found inside a 55-gallon steel fuel drum.
Floating in Tampa Bay.
Floating in Dumbfounding Bay near Miami.
Yeah.
He had been strangled and shot, and his legs had been sawed off.
It is really sad when someone wants to kill themselves that badly. Just really unfortunate. Call your friends, call your therapist, call any girl that you see. Just don't end up like him.
In his testimony to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Traficante would say he had been recruited for the Castro Project by fellow mobster John Roselli, who had testified in 1975 before the Church Committee about efforts to kill Castro. In April 1976, while Poppy was CIA director, Roselli was again called before the Church Committee, this time to testify about the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Then the oil drum thing happened. So we've got a renewed interest in the Kennedy assassination. But that's bad for Poppy. But as we just explained, most of the mob guys who were going to testify were like already dead. But there was just one loose thread that dangled out in front of Poppy this entire time, and that is his old family friend George de Mohrenschildt from right here in Dallas, Texas. In case you don't remember, George de Mohrenschildt was a Russian-born petroleum engineer who's like a Zelig figure to the whole Kennedy assassination. He was basically. He was the uncle of Poppy's prep school roommate at Andover. He was a friend of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy's parents, an associate of Oswald, a notorious womanizer and bon vivant who was rejected by the Wartime Office of Strategic Service for his alleged Nazi sympathies. George de Mohrenschildt was the guy who, longtime family friends with the Bush family. He has known Poppy since he was in high school, pretty much. And he keeps showing up in the life of Poppy H.W. Bush. And he shows up here in Dallas because he basically shepherds Lee Harvey Oswald and his Russian wife, Marina. He shepherds them into this community of Dallas white Russians and became like their sort of social confidant, a very close friend of theirs. De Mohrenschildt's wife, Jeanne, she was the one who claimed to have taken the photo of Oswald in the backyard, if you believe that photo was actually taken. While this is going on, in September of 1976, there's basically like a growing, after the Church Committee, a growing drumbeat of public interest, not just in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, but also in Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Robert Kennedy. So after months of debate, the House agreed to open a new investigation into all of them, hence the House Select Committee on Assassinations. January of that year, so at the beginning of the year, like September is when the House Select Committee on Assassinations is finally formed. In January of that year, George de Mohrenschildt had written to a Dutch TV reporter named Willem Altmans, who had struck up a friendship with George years earlier in Dallas when he was speaking to these like women's auxiliary groups that were like these fanatically arch-conservative Bircher types. And also, sidebar here about Willem Altmans, he did attend Yale and graduated in the same class as William F. Buckley. So like all these people know each other. It's really amazing. So he's talking to this guy Altmans, who's this weird. In the writing about him, he's described sort of similar to George de Mohrenschildt himself as sort of an intelligence-connected cipher. So he knows that George de Mohrenschildt is working on a memoir that he's seeking this Dutch TV reporter's help with. So Mohrenschildt is beginning to lose it. And later that year, he wrote this letter to George H.W. Bush, who was serving as the director of the CIA. This is an incredible letter that he wrote his old friend George. It's dated Dallas, September 5th. Dear George, you will excuse this handwritten letter. Maybe you will be able to bring a solution to the hopeless situation I find myself in. My wife and I find ourselves surrounded by some vigilantes. Our phone bugged and we are being followed everywhere. Either FBI is involved in this or they do not want to accept my complaints. We are driven to insanity by the situation. I have been behaving like a damn fool ever since my daughter Nadia died from cystic fibrosis over 3 years ago. I tried to write stupidly and unsuccessfully about Lee H. Oswald, and it must have angered a lot of people. I do not know, but to punish an elderly man like myself and my highly nervous and sick wife is really too much. Could you do something to remove the net around us? This will be my last request for help, and I will not annoy you anymore. Good luck in your important job. Thank you so much. Sincerely, George de Morenschild, 2737 Kings Road, apartment 142, if anyone wants to check that out.
First floor apartment, pretty tough for a JFK co-conspirator. You have to fuck up so bad to have known Bush your entire life, to have helped kill Kennedy, and you end up being this guy. It's like Joe Biden's dad missing out on the great wave of post-war prosperity. Two of the biggest bag fumbles of all time.
So obviously this letter hits the CIA's mail department.
I just want to
Where
say,
Ari Gold was working.
I just want to say, if I ever get the chance to write a letter to a secretary-level individual, I'm absolutely going to sign it off. Good luck with your important job.
He's like a pestering Jewish mom.
So imagine you're in the CIA mail department and you get a handwritten letter from a guy speaking on very friendly terms with the director of the CIA, and the guy happens to be a guy who is more associated with the Kennedy assassination than anyone other than Lee Harvey Oswald. So it's routed around the agency, and all these notes are appended to it, and then it finally gets across Director Bush's desk with this memo: Mr. Bush, do you know this individual? This is a side note to the director. And then in an internal CIA note, George H.W. Bush responded, I do know this man, de Morenschild. I first met him in the early 40s. He was an uncle to my Andover roommate. Later, he surfaced in Dallas in the 50s, maybe? He got involved in some controversial dealings in Haiti. Then he surfaced when Oswald shot to prominence. He knew Oswald before the assassination of President Kennedy. So that's I love that response because this is the head of the CIA who doesn't really recall much of anything about a close family friend who was that close to the guy who supposedly killed the president. But he refers to his controversial dealings in Haiti. I love that that's such intelligence OPSEC because he's talking about I recall he did some controversial things in Haiti and not the vastly more controversial dealings with Lee Harvey Oswald. So George Bush, director of the CIA, actually penned a personal response to George. It reads as such: Dear George, please forgive the delay in my reply to your September 5th letter. It took time to thoroughly explore the matters you raised. Let me first say that I know it must have been difficult for you to seek my help in the situation outlined in your letter. I believe I can appreciate your state of mind in view of your daughter's tragic death a few years ago and the current poor state of your wife's health. I was extremely sorry to hear of these circumstances. In your situation, I can well imagine how the attentions you described in your letter affect both you and your wife. However, my staff has been unable to find any indication of interest in your activities on the part of federal authorities in recent years. The flurry of interest that has attended your testimony before the Warren Commission has long since subsided. I can only suspect that you have become newsworthy, in quotation marks again, and in view of the renewed interest in the Kennedy assassination, and thus may be attracting the attention of people in the media. I hope this letter has been of some comfort to you, George, although I realize I am unable to answer your question completely. Thank you for your good wishes on my new job. As you can imagine, I'm finding it interesting and challenging. Very truly yours, George Bush, Director. Okay, so Dallas, Texas, Would it surprise you to learn that George de Mohrenschildt's life took a turn for the worse after sending the director of the CIA?
What? No. But he asked his old friend for help.
In November of that year, just 1 month after writing the letter, George's wife had him committed to a mental institution for 3 months at where? Dallas Parkland Hospital. That's right. You might remember Parkland as the hospital Kennedy was rushed to after getting his head blown off. She claimed, okay, so his wife, when upon admitting him, claimed that he had attempted suicide 3 times. Just important to get that on the record. He had been attempting suicide 3 times already. So if he ever pulls it off, just know there's a precedent there. He claimed, he attempted suicide, was hearing voices, and believed that the FBI and Jewish mafia was out to get him. Literally everyone but the CIA. And so his wife had him committed, in which he was treated with electroshock therapy. Oh. A year after, spoiler alert, George de Mohrenschildt kills himself. A year after his death, though, his wife would go on to tell a journalist a very different story about what precipitated George's hospitalization. I'm reading Family of Secrets here. She claimed that a doctor had appeared in Dallas for a brief period and administered injections to him. Following those injections, she said, George suffered a nervous breakdown, at which point she decided to have him hospitalized. The doctor, she claimed, vanished into thin air. I'll also note here, Jeanne de Mohrenschildt, George's wife, was also longtime friends with former CIA director Richard Helms. So I just want to close it out here with just a little bit about the circumstances surrounding George de Mohrenschildt's death. So in 1977, Bush leaves the CIA because he had a very, very short tenure as CIA director. He begged because the Republicans lost the election, and he begged Carter to allow him to extend his tenure and really